And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Ken Goudsward, best-selling author and independent researcher whose interests include archaeology, thaumaturgy, hermeneutics, and more. He writes in a variety of genres, including nonfiction, science fiction, dark comedy, and poetry. Today we'll be discussing his book, UFOs in the Bible. Ken, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me on. Really looking forward to it.
Me too. Now, how did you get interested in UFOs being in the Bible in the first place?
Well, I guess I'll have to blame Georgios Tsoukalos and his crew there.
Mm-hmm.
I am a big Ancient Aliens addict, and I've read I read quite a few of the books that they talk about on there. Chariots of the Gods, and some of the stuff by David Hatcher Childress and those guys. And so a lot of times they'll refer kind of almost in a slanting way, like they don't really talk about it, but they sort of almost talk about a few of the biblical stories, and basically it's assumed that there is a UFO connection there, and a lot of times they will try to explain it a little bit, but I mean, honestly, it's hard to explain. So when I first kind of saw those connections, it was fascinating to me because I was raised as a Christian and very much very involved in the church, and that was not something that we ever talked about there. Like, so they don't tell you about UFOs in Sunday school.
Yeah.
So I thought that well, this is a interesting discrepancy. And I mean, there's lots of interesting discrepancies in the Bible, and they're not all UFO related. But this was one thing that kind of I decided to just kind of look into it and follow up and figure it out on my own. And as I did so, it just kept on getting weirder and weirder, and I really went down a rabbit hole. So where most of the authors are talking about, maybe one or two events. You've always got Ezekiel. A lot of times there's going to be Enoch. Nobody's really talking about Moses, who's like really kind of the main character of the Old Testament. Like half the book, half the Old Testament revolves around the story of Moses and the Exodus and the books of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus. That's all the huge story about the Israelites' journey out of Egypt and eventually winding up in Canaan. Now, the interesting part about it is that during those 40 years of wandering around in the desert, they were following an object that was flying, they described it as a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of smoke in the day. And to me, that seemed very strange. And then when you look at the other parts of the story of Moses, it just continues to get more and more strange. And there's more and more descriptions of physical objects that are flying, that are metallic, and usually that involve fire. And lots of times there's a lot of loud noises, and various safety precautions that they had to take when coming near to these objects. And so I basically read the book of Exodus like cover to cover, word by word, and had to retranslate a lot of the Hebrew words in there to figure out what was going on, because the translations that we have, they're all based on essentially based on the King James version. I mean, they're all a little bit different, but nobody's really going taking the story a different way,
Mm-hmm.
So when I kind of started, wondering and asking, well, what are they actually talking about? It doesn't sound like the concept that of God that we talk about on Sunday. Like, we see God as being a spiritual being, um, and He's good and kind and love. But that doesn't really hold up to the story in terms of the way Moses describes it. Um, and a lot of people actually who are talking about this, I mean, I'm not the only one taking this kind of a approach. There's several. I've actually gotten to meet a lot of other authors in the last couple of years who have done similar research, and a lot of them are kind of um, jumping onto the fact that, well, the God in the Old Testament is actually kind of a dick, and he's not nice at all. So I'm not necessarily trying to say that, and in fact, I think that some of the way that I'm interpreting some of these events as being relating to UFOs actually make Yahweh more of a nice guy again, because it almost sounds, in some of the cases, um, sounds like there was some kind of radiation leakage, or there's this case where everybody gets sick, and Yahweh kills a whole bunch of them,
Hmm.
which is usually cited as proof that he's some kind of evil overlord. Um, but I have to wonder if it was um, such extreme radiation poisoning that it was more of a mercy killing, and when it wasn't actually Yahweh that killed him, it was just he told Moses to tell his guys to go around and kill everybody, which they did. And it seems maybe like it was more of like a medically assisted suicide because of the severe painful nature of these radiation burns.
What I find fascinating is that you mentioned that they were following around a pillar of fire and it was smoke during the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that we see things like that in the Bible and we just don't think anything about it. We just
Yeah,
accept that that's what it was and move on. We don't,
that's right.
question it. Why do you think we do that?
Well, I think when it comes to anything having to do with the Bible, it's intricately wrapped up with what we believe, and we're basically told what to believe. Even though I think there's a lot of lip service, I guess, in terms of um, church leadership wants you to read the Bible for yourself and come to your own conclusions, and they'll say that a lot, but it's not really true, because if you do have questions, that's fine. You're allowed to ask the questions as long as you bring them back to your pastor, and he'll tell you the right way to understand that, right? So there's this kind of kind of an illusion of open-mindedness, but you can't really take it to a logical conclusion. Um, and I started getting into trouble with that, which is, I guess, one of the reasons why I no longer attend church. But there's just a lot of very interesting discrepancies, I guess.
Is it true that in the Bible there are some words that do not have a translation?
Yes,
Can you tell us about some
there
of those?
absolutely. I actually have an appendix specifically about that, which I didn't print out. But so there's a bunch of words which only appear in the Bible maybe once. Those There's actually a specific term for that theologians use, which is a Latin phrase called hapax legomena, and what it means is basically this word only occurs once. That's a Latin phrase. So, uh, but beyond that, there's words that occur maybe a handful of times, maybe 5 or 6 or 10 times, um, but they're always occurring in the same way. So, like, for example, um, seraphim is a good example of that. Now, the word seraphim is classically understood as a type of angel, maybe like an archangel type of a thing. The problem with that is that the Bible doesn't actually have angels. Angel is not a word that's in the Bible until you get to the New Testament, because the New Testament is written in Greek. So, but then the term for angel is basically borrowing a Greek word from the Greek culture, and then overlaying it onto this new Christian culture, which doesn't really have any kind of conceptual framework for it. It's not a Jewish concept, so it gets really muddled. So in the Old Testament, the closest thing to an angel is the Malachim, which again has this I am ending. Oh, I guess we haven't talked about the Elohim yet, but we will. So anytime in the Old Testament when you find a Hebrew word that ends in I am, it means the people of, or the people who, or these people, or whatever. So basically it's plural, and it generally refers to an intelligent being. Sometimes it's an animal, but most of the time it's human or better. So it can identify where you're from, or it can identify your career choice. So like type of thing as like Americans or blacksmiths, right? So that works for the "im" suffix, as does what different species apparently, because you now have the cherubim, the seraphim, the Elohim, and so the Elohim is one of the most used words in the Hebrew Old Testament, and the root word El for Elohim is also just an ordinary word in Hebrew. So sometimes they talk about the people of El, and sometimes they just use the word El. And every time they do that in just kind of a mundane context, the word El means to, as in I'm going to your house, or we came to earth. So the Elohim are the people who came to. It doesn't tell us where they came from. But why then are we translating Elohim as God, and specifically a single monotheistic God who has supreme powers, when that doesn't really jive with what the Elohim are described as doing in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Genesis.
Do you think that the Old Testament is distinguishing between God and then the Elohim who created the planet? Like there's still, I guess the Old Testament calls God Yahweh, and that God is still higher than the Elohim?
I think it's actually the opposite way. I think that, and I haven't really gotten into this in my current books yet, but it's coming for a future released book, which is going to be kind of my I guess my magnum opus, and it's going to take me a while to get that one ready. But essentially, yeah, I can jump the gun a little bit, and without any proof right now, it's starting to look to me like the Elohim were a group of individuals who came from some other planet, came to Earth, did not create Earth, but did some kind of political manipulation, or maybe it was a punishment on them. It's either they were exiled to Earth, or they basically came to Earth as immigrants, which I think is the immigration theory is the way I'm leaning right now, because that lines up very closely with the Sumerian stories that I'm also looking into, and which I talk about in my book, the Enuma Elish. So that tells the story of the Sumerian gods coming to Earth, and then they proceed to do a bunch of things that are very similar to some of the things that the book of Genesis talks about. So I think that the Elohim are essentially the same people as what are called the Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts. And then basically they kind of set up some rules and kind of some jurisdiction, and then they either took off or they are still here and they became us perhaps, or like evolutionarily speaking, we don't know which ones we came from or which ones were somebody previous. But in the book of Genesis they talk about the Nephilim, and so there's this intermixing of the Elohim and some other species, and then the Nephilim are formed. And the Nephilim doesn't mean giants. I'll just only say that much about it. But it's also very clear that the Nephilim might be us, or they might be somebody previous to us. But what is clear in that verse is it says it refers to another group of people called the mighty men of old, the heroes of old, and they're called the Gibbelim. And so these heroes of old, which are the famous men, so the Shemim. But the weird thing is, this is only in Genesis chapter 6. So there's only been 5 chapters so far. In the first 4 chapters, we're talking about what we typically think of as a creation story, but is actually several separate creation myths. And then the story about the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and their family. And then basically we get right into, hey, remember these mighty men of old? And we're like, no, what? Like, who are you talking about? Well, I think that they are referring to other mythologies that are no longer part of the Hebrew and the Christian traditions, but very well might be the Sumerian myths. So they might actually just be talking about the Anunnaki, and perhaps even some of the famous named gods of Sumer, such as Enki and Enlil and Marduk.
Well, to get back to the words that don't have translation, do you think those are possibly Sumerian or even extraterrestrial words?
I don't know enough about Sumerian linguistics to answer that. However, I do know a couple of things about Sumerian linguistics, and just from that very limited glimpse, there doesn't seem to be strong correlation between the languages of Sumer, Akkadian, Babylon, and the Hebrew. Although I'm kind of lying when I say that, because there is definitely some correlation. So, for example, Zechariah Sitchin talks a lot about the word Shem, which he translates as rockets. So basically, in the Bible, there's a group called the Shemim, and they come into play right away in the first verse of Genesis 1:1. You have the Elohim and the Shemim mentioned. And so it is interesting that in terms of Sitchin lore, the Shemim would be the rocket men, which is an interesting way to look at it. And I kind of tried that interpretation, and it basically works. Like it doesn't, the story doesn't fall apart if you assume that Shemim are the rocket men. But I actually think that because of the root word Shem in the Hebrew, if you look at the places where the word Shem is used, and it is used a lot, Shem generally means name, but that's sort of like a literal, I guess, a figurative way of looking at it, because what it really means is like famous or even infamous. So, and I actually think that it's linguistically has survived through the Proto-Indo-European into the European languages and into English as the word shame. So shame, it's almost the same word linguistically, and semantically they're very similar in terms of what they mean. Although we have in recent times we've really shifted shame to only mean being famous for a bad thing, whereas in the original usage of Shem, it was used for both. You were famous, whether or not it was for a bad thing or for a good thing, and there was examples of both of those.
Oh.
So yeah, that's one kind of interesting example about how, you just have to look at how the root word is used in the rest of the Bible. And I guess before the show, I had mentioned Strong's Concordance, and that has been a invaluable tool for me. In that, basically, what it is it's a database that's 100 years old at least, because it was invented in paper form, and now it exists electronically. But you can compare the meaning and the context of any word in the Bible. And you can also see exactly every single time it's used. So there's some words that are in the Bible that are used like 2,000 times. And then there's a lot of words that are used like 10 times. And so those are the ones that I find interesting, because that's where you have things like cherubim, for example. So the cherubim pops up a couple of dozen times, but mostly in the book of Exodus, and where essentially you can consider that one usage, because it's one author telling one story and mentioning this particular object, and then it pops up in the book of Genesis right after the Garden of Eden story, where this cherubim was essentially seems like some kind of robot. It was like a guardian robot, and it had a flaming sword, and it was set there to prevent Adam and Eve from re-entering the garden after they're kicked out. Then the cherubim shows up again in the Moses story, and Moses mentions the cherubim many times, and basically, again, you have this fire motif, but also the cherubim are coming down from the sky. Now, so there's this association with the whole stories of all the stories of Moses, where things are coming down from the sky, landing on top of Mount Sinai. Now they're following things around in the desert for 40 years that are flying in the sky. Then the cherubim, basically, you don't see them anymore, except that Moses is told to make cherubim for the tabernacle, and later on to become the temple under Solomon. The only problem with that theory is that Yahweh would not tell Moses to make an image of cherubim. Like, we think of it as a decoration, like he's supposed to make a decoration that looks like an angel. Well, Yahweh just finished telling Moses the 10 Commandments, like literally on the same page. And the 10 Commandments says, I am a jealous God, you shall not worship anything else. And also, do not make any images of anything in the heavens or on earth. So if Yahweh literally just said those 2 commandments and then turned around the same day and said, oh, by the way, I want you to make a bunch of sculptures for me, like, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So in the book, it's kind of complicated to talk about here, but in the book I wrestle through a lot of like trying to interpret how that can make any sense. And essentially what I come down to is that these cherubim are not actually an image or a figure or a statue. They're actually something like some kind of machine that Moses has been given blueprints, and Moses had a guy whose one job was to make this stuff, just the cherubim stuff, not any of the other stuff. They had weavers, they had woodworkers, they had all of these other guys. Um, they had this one guy who was specially trained to just work on this cherubim project. And in order to do that, he had to go up on Mount Sinai and stay there for 40 days to learn the protocols, the programming languages, whatever they were doing up there. The Elohim were teaching this one man how to implement cherubim on Earth.
That's
Like,
interesting.
it's crazy. Then the cherubim later show up in, guess what, the Ezekiel story. Then they also appear to one of the other prophets. And so and in both of those cases, again, there's like these very flying saucer-ish kind of descriptions. And there's always metal. It's always like burning bronze. It's always coming down from the sky and talking to these guys.
In your book, UFOs in the Bible, you talk about how you organized it to the Hynek scale.
Right.
Can you tell my audience what that scale is and why you did that?
Sure. So you guys will probably recognize Hynek. I can't think of his first name at the moment. Gary, maybe? What is it?
I don't remember his name either.
I can't remember his first name. But this guy Hynek was the guy in charge of Project Blue Book. So after the Roswell incident in New Mexico, of course, somebody wasn't aware that they weren't allowed to talk about it, and they blew the lid wide open. And so now the cat's out of the bag, and the government has to do something about it. So what they do is they set up a program to investigate. So don't worry, we'll investigate. Yeah, kind of like how if you find a giant skeleton, you should just send it to the Smithsonian. So, so the government's doing this, and they go through a couple of different iterations of the project, which didn't really get off the ground too well. The first one was called Project. What was the first one? The second one was called Project Grudge, which is already an interesting twist because somebody's got a grudge that they're now having to suppress this, because the first iteration had a more open sounding name. It was like Project Disclosure or something. Not exactly, right? But almost that way. I wish I could remember the name of it. But so by the third iteration is when they now bring Hynek on board, and he is a professor and I think a physicist, but like basically he's a smart guy and he knows a lot of stuff. And so they figure we'll get him to do this. He'll be the face of the project. And they thought that they could basically give him a pretty long leash, but also really be able to reel him in when they needed to. And they did definitely need to. But at any rate, Hynek was publicly put out there and was like, hey, this is the guy. He's going to investigate everything very thoroughly. You know, he's a professor. He knows what he's doing. And he did. He was very good with the research methodology. And so one of the first things he did was basically recognizing that the UFO phenomenon is very complex. And so he didn't want to just, start writing down everything that everybody said. And he must have interviewed thousands of witnesses. I mean, actually, I do know the number was somewhere in the ballpark of 10,000 or 50,000, somewhere in that range. I can't remember, but there was a paper released by the FBI saying that shortly after the first round of interviews, they had to basically get a big shredder because they just didn't have room to store all these documents. So the FBI is admitted has admitted to shredding UFO evidence, even from the get-go. This was like the first 2 years of the project. Anyway, so Hynek wants to get this thing organized a little bit better. So what he does is he's interested in kind of categorizing what are the types of things that you saw. Okay, so like, hey man, I saw a UFO. Okay, well, what type of an encounter was it? So firstly, he's only interested in close encounters. So what he did was, there's close encounters and there's not so close or far encounters or lights in the sky. So the bulk of the time, if you're on the MUFON Facebook page or UFOs over Canada or whatever page you're on, there's tons of people who are every day are saying, hey, look at this cool thing I saw, it must be a UFO. Okay, but most of the time, it's a light. Is it a star? Is it an airplane? I don't know. I can't tell. It's a light. It's a dot, right? We have very little information. Unless it's moving erratically, then it gets interesting. But a lot of times it's not. It might just be sitting there or just flying in a, normal kind of airplane looking pattern. So Hynek wasn't really interested in those because there's not a lot you can do with it. So what he said was, we were going to focus on encounters of objects or crafts or entities that have come within 500 feet of the observer, which is a pretty high bar, right? So, and he still managed to get thousands and thousands of records building up. So what he did was, anything under 500 feet, now we're interested and we're going to make a file of it. But we still want to classify it further. So there's going to be type 1, or he called it the first kind. So he called it the first kind, the second kind, third kind, fourth kind. So this is where we get the name of the movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So the third kind is where you actually see or meet even an actual extraterrestrial entity. So backing up a scale, you get the second kind, which is where you see an object and some kind of physical evidence. So whether it be cattle mutilations plus a UFO, like not just the cattle mutilation, that's not really a UFO encounter. But if there's a cattle mutilation or a crop circle or burnt grass, and somebody saw something flying, then that's considered of the second kind. The first kind is like, I saw a thing, it was flying right over there, it was less than 500 feet away. So basically, as you get a higher kind, you have more strangeness and more detail in terms of. So what I did was, I wanted to kind of set the stage in terms of looking at these less detailed kind of encounters in the Bible first before I got into the weird stuff. One of the reasons I did that was because I wasn't convinced by any means that UFOs were real, for one thing, and that the biblical writers had seen a UFO. So I was coming from a pretty skeptical stance and going, yeah, it's all well and fine for Von Daniken to say that Ezekiel saw a UFO, but what's his evidence? And so now the Ezekiel story comes a lot later because it's the at least third kind, right? But so I didn't want to jump into that. I kind of wanted to see if there was any kind of framework for even a simple UFO encounter in the Bible. So I looked at the first kind first. Actually, the first one I looked at wasn't even a close encounter, but it was an important enough part of the story that I included it anyways, because it's the Star of Bethlehem, which is a really interesting story. And so I go into quite a bit of analysis detailed in terms of how that that object moved across the sky. It was definitely not an airplane, although if anyone had seen it today, that would be what it would be classified as. But of course, they didn't have airplanes or satellites then. So a lot of theologians have essentially surmised that, well, it had to have been a comet. Okay. Yeah, sure. Maybe it was a comet.
Don't people also think currently that the star Bethlehem was like overlapping planets or overlapping stars that made it brighter than usual?
Sure. And there's a lot of things that it could be in terms of that kind of an astronomical explanation, except none of those actually add up when you look at the movement of this object, because it came from the east, and these wise men were able to follow it, so from quite far away. So we don't know where that exactly was, but it was at least hundreds of miles, possibly thousands of miles. And so, were they following it in one night? No. Were they following it in a week? Maybe a month. In any rate, they saw an object that was stationary enough that they could follow it for an extended period, but also mobile enough that they could follow where it was leading them to. Now, you could also interpret that, well, it doesn't necessarily have to move. It maybe just appeared in a certain spot in the sky and they walked towards it. Okay, that's possible too. Except that um, there's two problems with that. The first one is they followed it to a certain area, and then they had to stop and ask for directions. So remember, the wise men went and talked to King Herod, and they said, "Hey, where's this new king of the Jews who was born?" Well, of course, King Herod didn't like that, and so that's a whole other side quest story. But they had to stop to ask where they needed to go, and so once they were sort of pointed in the right direction, well, were they even? That part of the story is a little bit unclear. But then later, whether it's a few days later or a week later, we're not sure. But now the star has brought them to Bethlehem, which is a very small village, and not only to Bethlehem, but somehow it leads them to the exact house, or possibly manger, in the stable, which is actually not necessarily true either. But somehow, whatever this location was, this object has led these guys to a very, very specific location, which is impossible to do if they're following something that is cosmic in nature, or orbiting, or any of those kinds of explanations, and certainly not for a comet, because comets do not suddenly stop unless they impact the Earth. So if they happen to be following it and it impacted, and they were able to find the impact spot, maybe that could work. But there's nothing in the story about any kind of landing, which is weird, because in all the other stories of UFOs in the Bible, the story is very clear that an object came down and landed, and usually somebody got out and talked to them or something. This is the only story where nothing lands, so like it's just not adding up. However, now look at the shepherd's perspective. Remember, the shepherds were abiding in the fields watching their flocks by night, and they said that the way they described it was, they saw, suddenly in the sky, they saw a brilliant light, and they described clouds and the sounds of angels' voices. So something loud, and I don't know what an angel voice sounds like, but it probably doesn't sound like, oh, I mean, but maybe it does if it's like a high-pitched whine, right? So were they seeing some kind of machinery? It's not super clear, but it seems like the shepherds had a better view than the wise man or anyone else in the story, including Jesus and Mary and Joseph. The shepherds might the shepherd's point of view might be considered a close encounter, but it would be a close encounter of the first kind. So even though the star for most of the story is more than 500 feet away, when you consider the shepherd's experience, they saw something.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about an example of a close encounter of the second kind? Can you give us
Sure.
one?
Yes, I can. So one of the most well-known ones of that is of Jacob. Um, so Jacob actually had several UFO encounters. His first two were a couple days apart, or possibly one day apart. Um, he was on his way to go visit his brother Esau, and he was a nomad at this time. So it was him and his family and a whole bunch of um, well, not it's not clear if they were servants necessarily, but essentially he was like almost like a Bedouin sheik, where he had this whole like hundreds of people that were with him, and he was like their leader for whatever reason. And they all had sheep and cows and all that stuff. So there's this huge crowd, and they're traveling through the wilderness. Of course, Israel is a pretty barren place. So when you're traveling with sheep and a lot of mouths to feed, you kind of have to take your time. And it's not like, oh, hey, look at there's green pastures everywhere. So you're a bit limited as to where you can go. On their way, they're traveling through this one area that's close to a river. On one side of the river, there's hills on both sides of the river. And Jacob's on one side of the river, Jacob and all his people, and he looks across the river and he sees what he calls an encampment of the Malachim. Now, the Malachim, again, we have another I am word, and it's a plural, and it's these guys. Malach means message. So these are the messengers. So he knows who these guys are. He recognizes them from however he knows, I'm not sure. But obviously, it was something that was already in the zeitgeist or the motif of the culture. And so he was able to identify, hey, look, there's a whole crew of Malachim over there. Um, and basically they seem to just be camped out. So he named that place two camps, and that's specifically noted in the Bible. This place is named two camps, and that place is probably still named that today. Then he goes. Okay, I'm getting a little bit foggy on the chronology. It might be the next night, or it might be later that same, like the night of that day. This is where he now has a closer encounter. So he was seeing these guys across the river. It's I want to be clear that these guys were not human, and that's made pretty clear in some of the other Hebrew words that are used in this story. There's a word ish, which is uh, essentially means like but not the same. So sort of like how ish kind of still means that now ish, right? Like you know, ish,
Yeah.
but not quite. So he said these guys are kind of human, but not quite, and they're over there, and but we're just doing our thing. So he basically didn't want to interact with them. They're kind of doing their own business. He's on his way to get to his brother's place, but he at night while he's asleep, one of these Malachim comes and interrupts him. And so it's the way that this story is told in the Bible. It's a little bit you can't really tell if he's dreaming or if this is really happening. But so essentially, this being comes to him. He has a bit of a conversation with him, and they end up wrestling, this is hilarious. So like, okay, there's an ET. I'm going to suplex that guy. Like, what? So, but anyway, the long and short of it is the reason this is a second kind story is because Jacob um, was injured during the wrestling match, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. So that is the physical evidence that something happened there. I mean, he could have just been sleepwalking and sprained his ankle, but again, that heals too, right?
Wouldn't you actually classify that as a third kind because he's wrestling to me, which suggests contact?
Yeah, you're right. But the second kind ones, there weren't very many, so I threw that into second kind.
Oh. I didn't realize that there was contact. I thought all of his stuff was basically based on a dream.
Well, that's the thing, is that is the way that story is still taught in Sunday school, and this is something that we teach our children when they're 5 or 6 years old. As let's learn the story of Jacob, and they do teach it in terms of a dream, but it's clearly not a dream because dreams don't leave marks. However, yeah, there's most of the examples in the Bible are third encounter, third types. So I was a little hard pressed to find enough to talk about to fill out my second kind part, and that seemed like a good candidate.
Is there anywhere in the Bible where there's like scorched earth due to a craft?
Yes and no. So there's definitely scorched earth, but not necessarily like that kind of scorched earth. The scorched earth that we find in the Bible is where a craft comes through and kills everyone. So we're talking about entire villages basically slaughtered, sometimes with what appear to be there appear to be different mechanisms or weaponry used for doing this. Sometimes there's slow death involved, and that's explicitly stated. Like, hey, you guys don't worry, I'm going to go ahead of you. So this is primarily when the Israelites are about to cross over the Jordan River into Canaan. Remember that thing that they were following around for 40 years? When they get to the river, that thing changes its MO. And now, okay, you guys now know where you're going, so you don't have to follow me. I'm going to take off in front of you, and don't come too close because I'm going to be spreading disease or possibly radiation. We don't know what it is, but it's basically says, I'm going ahead of you and I will prepare the way to make your enemies weak so that when you do come in, they'll either already be dead or they'll be sick and dying, and you can just, waltz your way in. So, like, really weird.
In your book, it may be under the third kind classification, but you talk about the merkaba and you talk about the Star of David, and I think you even imply that the Star of David and the merkaba is basically the shape of a UFO. Is that correct?
That is what I'm implying. Now, I can't prove it, and so it is merely an implication. But when you look at the way that the merkaba ties directly to the cherubim, and that is because both of those words are used to describe different aspects of the same encounters multiple times. So this happens in Ezekiel, and this also happens in the whole big long Moses story, although it's a little bit hard to pin down because that story is very drawn out. But there's these strange motifs which bring up a lot of other Hebrew words that fall into the hapax legomena theory, or the bucket, I guess. So you've got words which are generally translated as face or wings or eyes, and they are used to paint an anthropomorphized picture of Ezekiel's kind of crazy narrative. Now, when Ezekiel wrote down what he saw, he had no idea what he was looking at, and so he basically tells us what he saw. Um, Later on, so because that happens in the first chapter of Ezekiel, later on in Ezekiel, he re-encounters the same object and he gets more information. Then again, this happens several times. So by his third or fourth encounter, he's actually able to call things by their proper names because he hears the beings in the craft referring to certain things by name. So by now he's sort of become aware of their jargon, their lingo, and I don't know if they're talking Hebrew or like maybe like you mentioned, maybe they're talking some angelic or extraterrestrial language, and he learns a couple of these words. But at any rate, there's all these strange technical terminology that because we don't know what he's talking about, and the original translators of the King James Bible certainly had no conception of flying machines. Like they wouldn't interpret it that way because they've never seen a flying machine. Well, they might have, but I mean, I think the assumption is that they were limited to middle age technology. However, I mean, it's entirely possible that they did see a UFO, but in that case, they probably would have interpreted it differently. So they probably did. These guys are, probably in a monastery in Italy or someplace, and working away diligently at the Lord's work and trying to translate the best they can with these very strange documents. And so essentially, I kind of do uh, I take these words like the panim, the ophonym. There's these other words, and again, these have this "im" ending, which is a plural ending, but it also generally is applied to intelligent beings. However, in the case of Ezekiel's encounter, things start to get really weird. So why it sounds a lot like he's talking about some kind of machine and it's flying, but also it seems to have some kind of attributes of an intelligent being. So is it a robot? Is it some kind of AI type of thing? Um, there's indication indications both in Ezekiel and in the book of Daniel, as well as a couple of different parts of the Moses narrative, where it seems like they might be using some kind of holographic projection type of like thing. Like there's like some parts where it's literally looks just like Princess Leia leaning over, telling R2D2, "He's your only hope." Like um, so when you read it with reading and trying to piece together all these words, you have to kind of turn them around and twist them around and see where they start to make sense, which I kind of walk you through the process in my book. So I don't come to these words and say, "Oh, this is what it means." Instead, I go, I don't know what this means, but I don't think it means what we think it means. And then what could it possibly mean? So we kind of walk through the process together a lot.
Is the word merkaba in the Bible?
Um, is the word merkaba in the Bible? I do not remember, but it certainly is. The word merkaba is very prominent in a Jewish sect that was quite popular in, I want to say, the third and second centuries BC. Um, And basically, they their whole big deal was that they interpret it as a chariot, which is interesting because a chariot is a, transportation craft, um, and they call it the flying chariot. So the merkaba is a flying chariot, according to Jewish tradition, that apparently Yahweh rides in. This concept, although not the exact word, appears many times throughout the Psalms, for one. So in the book of Psalms, David talks a lot about this flying chariot, and he calls it the cherubim. So again, this is interesting because you've got these different views of this of certain things that are popping up with slightly different aspects. So I'm basically saying the cherubim is the merkaba. This chariot is a simple, like a metaphor, I guess, or you could say a simile, something. You have to call it something, and if they didn't know what it was called, a chariot is just as good as any. It does provide a lot of information because chariots are made out of metal. Chariots are shiny. Chariots are carry people, and although they don't typically fly, if you call it a flying chariot, now they do. So so you've got a flying metal object with that's shiny, and actually chariots are kind of loud and noisy too. Um, you wouldn't necessarily think of that unless you've watched the movie Ben-Hur recently. But and they're also a essentially a weapon. So at the time, the chariot was the war tank, right? Like that was the highest technology in terms of military technology that existed for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Um, David in the Psalms refers to Yahweh specifically riding on his chariot, coming down from the sky, and actually blasting his enemies, or at least scaring them away, with what seems to be some kind of laser beam. Um, and this is a kind of a common motif in the Psalms. It comes up in at least three different Psalms. Um, so the merkaba, the chariot, the cherubim, and also I believe that it has to do with some of the unnamed objects that Ezekiel first described, because he's talking about these four faces and six wings. And so I'm thinking if you were to draw something that had four of one thing and six of another thing, there's a couple of ways you can draw this as a geometric figure. Uh, One way you could do it is as a okay, I play D&D, so I'm looking at a D8. Okay, so it's got basically it's kind of like two D4s um, overlapping each other.
Right, like two pyramids,
Yeah.
opposing
Um,
pyramids. And I wanted to ask you, do they describe that shape of the two opposing pyramids anywhere?
well, I think they do, but it's not clear. But I think that that is possibly what they mean, when Yahweh gives Moses the specific directions of how to build a cherubim. Here's some really very strange facts here. The cherubim have four wings, similar to the description that Ezekiel gave. Now, I think that there's some misinterpretation between wings and faces. I think that wings and faces are sort of uh, the same thing, kind of like how you could describe a D6 as having six faces, but also how many edges does it have? There's more than six. So what is it? 10? I don't know. I don't know how to figure out that math. But if you look at uh, a triangle, for example, has one face in the middle, but three edges, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all these geographic or geometric objects are built out of, if you build them out of say, sheet steel, then you're going to be interested in how many faces they have. But if you're building them out of steel rod, you're going to be interested in how many edges they have, and the faces are going to be blank. So I think that that kind of goes two ways of talking about the same thing, how many edges versus how many surfaces they have. And so I believe that when we are interpreting these things as having four faces or six wings, I think that's one way of saying the same thing. Also, so after Yahweh gives Moses the blueprints, apparently, he is told to build two cherubim, and they are supposed to be facing each other, and it describes the positions of their wings. So again, we have these same words, faces and wings, and applied directly to the cherubim in this case, and indirectly through the stories of Ezekiel. And it is indirect because the way that Ezekiel tells his story, you can't tell what he's talking about unless you look at both of his encounters simultaneously, because his language for them changes. So yeah, I think that the whatever Moses and his highly trained, 40 days on top of Sinai craftsmen, whatever they were building or programming had some kind of geometric component to it. So maybe it had something to do with like power generation, free energy, all these kind of woo-woo things that a lot of people like to talk about. They do seem crazy, but there's a little bit of evidence to support that it could be something like along those lines.
According to Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, that means that abductions are involved. Where are abductions in the Bible?
Oh, they're all over the place. So the most obvious one is Enoch. And Enoch is a strange character because he literally shows up in the Bible in one verse. His name is used precisely once. However, he's also got a whole series of books about him, but they're not generally considered canon. Depending on which church tradition you grew up in, sometimes they are. But even if they're not, the canonical Gospels refer to Enoch at least 3 different times. So in the book of Jude, and a couple other places whose references I am not remembering at the moment. But Enoch seems to be something that was accepted until it wasn't. So it is interesting, though, that again, kind of like these heroes of old, the book of Genesis goes, oh yeah, you guys know the story about Enoch. Yeah, of course we do. So it assumes that we do. And even then, what it says about Enoch in just the very few words is Enoch walked with the Elohim, and he was not. This is the typical translation. I need to look into that one a little bit more, but I'm kind of okay with the way that we interpret it. Enoch walked with the Elohim, and he was not, for Yahweh took him. So what? So I mean, okay, well, he, was just taken to heaven. Okay, fine, except that heaven doesn't exist in the Bible. There's no mention of the type of conceptualization of heaven that we teach in church today, or hell for that matter. Those are not found in the Old Testament anywhere. Once you start to get into the New Testament, you get a little bit of that is coming in, but it certainly is not outlaid as there's nowhere in the Bible that says, hey, look, this is how heaven and hell work. Like it's just not like that. So basically Enoch is taken. And that's all we know. In the book of Enoch, though, he describes what that experience was like. And it's pretty interesting. I'm not yet an expert on the Book of Enoch. I have only read it a couple times, probably not even the whole thing. But what I've gathered so far is he went up into the sky by the ruach, which is another interesting word that pops up in the Old Testament in a lot of places, and we always translate it as the Spirit, or like so the Holy Spirit. And it's usually like the Holy Spirit we think is like one of the Trinity. However, when it's used in the Old Testament, the Ruach has nothing to do with Yahweh and Jesus. It is the Ruach Elohim. So it is the object of the Elohim. It could be a craft. It's not super clear. I lean towards the interpretation that the Ruach is a spaceship of some kind. And it might be the same one as the Cherubim and the merkaba, or it might be a different one. There does seem to be different types of ships, which that shows up in some of the Moses story, which I talk about. I go into a little bit of detail there, but sorry, where was I going with this? Oh yeah. So Enoch is taken up by the Ruach and disappears essentially, and he's never seen again. Now he's not the only one that happens to. Elijah is a prophet who lived at least 1,000 years after Enoch, and during the time of the Babylonian captivity in roughly 600 BC. And now you have Elijah, who is, again, he's a prophet. So what is a prophet? He's a guy who talks, who tells people words that he claims he's gotten from God. So Elijah doesn't specifically, well, actually, does he? Let me just check here. Does Elijah have UFO encounters? Oh, he does. So I actually talk about Elijah's UFO encounters in three different places in the book, and that shows up in the Bible references of 1 Kings chapter 19, 2 Kings chapter 2, and even in Matthew chapter 17, they talk about Elijah and his UFO encounter. The details of that are escaping me at the moment, but what I do know is that Elijah, well, maybe it's just that in the way he was taken. So Elijah had already been in contact with someone who was giving him messages to tell the public, and also a lot of times to tell the king or the priests or whatever. So he was kind of a mucky muck, and he knew all the important people. And he seemed to be getting these messages that they sometimes listened to. So they weren't just like, oh, this guy's an idiot from, like, why would they listen to him? He's got a good reputation. And when he basically is ready to retire, what happens? The cherubim, or the chariot, comes from the sky, and this is an interesting one, because this one uses the word ruach, but it also describes how he is literally taken up. Like, you can almost, like, the way the story is told, you can almost see him just like levitating up into this chariot. So that's about as UFO abduction as you can get. And then it happens again. It happens to Isaiah and to Ezekiel.
Now,
and those guys are so Elijah is taken and never returned, similar to Enoch. But Ezekiel and Isaiah are taken up in the same manner, described very similarly to this tractor beam kind of thing, pulling them up into a craft. And then they're taken somewhere else, They're shown something, they do some stuff, and then they come back.
Today's version of CE5 is based on Dr. Greer's work, or Close Encounters 5. And that's basically, people going out and meditating and trying to contact UFOs or initiating contact. So you are seeing that as well in the Bible?
Well, that's kind of a fundamental practice of Christianity. We're supposed to pray every day. Well, what is praying? It's going into a meditative state. If, not always, but if you want your prayers to be answered, you should be in a meditative state. And so there's a lot of discipline around that. There are people who have essentially devoted their entire lives to nothing but praying. Maybe they'll do a little bit of gardening here and there, but their main focus is that of this discipled prayer life. And these people are called monks and nuns, and there's millions of them, and there have been for thousands of years, and it's very mainstream. Like, it's about as mainstream as you get, right? So is CE5 a mainstream Christian tradition? You're darn right it is. What do we expect? Is it maybe a different question?
Right.
And then another question on top of that is, well, what results do we get? And sadly, most of the time, the results are nil. But I am a believer that sometimes they are not nil. I've actually seen healings occur, and some other really weird things that I can't explain in any other way other than some kind of spiritual entity is listening, knows what we're up to, cares about us, and wants to help us out.
What do you think about talking in tongues?
I've done it. I've experienced it, but I do not understand it. And that's kind of the point. Although there's debate about that, because some people interpret it as, like in the Book of Acts, depending on how literally you read the Book of Acts, you can make a good case that the apostles or the disciples who were there were literally speaking a different language, and the other people there were able to understand them. And I mean, that's basically literally what it says in Acts chapter 5. Could that be interpreted a slightly different way? I think there's room for interpretation around that. So I think it's possible that, like, some people think speaking in tongues is like the language of angels, let's say. I don't think that it's really either of those, but either of them work in terms of that story. For Acts, that if you're speaking in let's say somebody walks into your church who doesn't speak any English. They're fresh off the boat from wherever, and suddenly you speak in their language and you're interpreting what the pastor is saying in his sermon, and they're able to get the message. So that's kind of how the Book of Acts story is presented. But it also works if it's some kind of spiritual or heavenly language, or language of angels, or whatever they're calling it. I think that concept still works, because the pastor's saying a thing, you're saying something that is somehow communicated to this other person. So rather than it simply being you experiencing some superpower, both you and the person hearing it are experiencing this superpower in terms of, communicating some strange way. Maybe it's just a psychic phenomenon.
Ken, I need to switch gears with you. Where can we find your book, UFOs in the Bible, as well as your other books?
I'm glad you asked. So my books are on Amazon. So if you go into Amazon and you search for my name, that's one way of finding all my books. The other way you could go is go to my website, which is dimensionfold.com. And you're going to see, maybe not immediately. Basically, that is my publishing company website. So it's got my stuff and the other stuff that I publish for other people. But I'm definitely in there, and it shouldn't be too hard to find me. Um, so yeah, I have this book on the Bible, UFOs on the Bible. I have a book on magic in the Bible. I have a book on the Sumerian mythology of the Enuma Elish. And if you're into that, I'm working on a second follow up to that on the Atrahasis epic. And I'm also currently writing a book on more of the scientific kind of side of ufology, and it's called Fermi's Paradox is Bull. So that'll be out in the next month or two.
After watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
I'm open to that. I'm not open to people just telling me if that's BS or whatever. I mean, feel free to tell me that if you feel you have to get it off your chest, and I'm the only one who's going to listen, but I might not reply back. But yeah, I'm open to discussion. For a while there, I was even inviting people onto my YouTube channel to talk about stuff. I'm taking a little bit of a break from that, just because I got to focus on finishing up some other projects. But yeah. Certainly, there is a contact page on my Dimension Fold website. Feel free to reach out. And I would especially love to hear from people, from other authors who maybe have books on the subject of UFOs or any kind of all this other weird stuff that we're talking about. I would love to talk to you guys about that. If anybody is an author that needs a publisher, we should chat. And yeah, I hope I do hear from some listeners.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Oh man, I might not be the right guy to give you a positive message, but no, I think that no matter what you believe, and kind of what your take is on all of these strange things that seem to be happening around us, and have been doing so for a long time. However you can understand that in a way that makes sense to you, I think is very valuable. So I'm not trying to dissuade anybody from even like standard religion or any kind of interpretations. I just want to explore what might be true. And so I'm not even saying that I believe any of the things that I write. I'm saying, what if, right? Does this work? And if we can find multiple ways of understanding phenomena that are internally cohesive, I think that only can strengthen our understanding of the world around us. And I actually don't think that you should believe one way or the other. I think you should investigate many different ways of believing, and that's true in terms of ufology, and that's also true in terms of religion. Check out Taoism, check out Buddhism, check out Hinduism. Talk to people. I have recently made some friends who are very knowledgeable about Hinduism, and really enlightened me in terms of what I thought I knew about Hinduism, and I was pretty far off. So yeah, the same is true of politics. We think we know what's what. No, we don't know. So I guess that would be my positive thing is we don't know the answer. Maybe there isn't an answer, but it's fun to explore.
Ken, thank you for that message, and thank you again for being my guest.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.